So, um, so the second moment which we are talking here is the earthquake, 1985 earthquake. Uh, it was near Mexico City, which is the capital of Mexico, and lot of buildings were destroyed, and people were trapped in the rubble or killed. And the response, if you're talking about a government capacity here, the government did not show a lot of steering capacity when here. When the crisis hits, they were nowhere near enough uh, responders. They were nowhere near enough responders, and people were left trapped underneath buildings, and there was uh, no aid coming from the government to pull away these heavy girders and things like that. The response of this was that people said, you know, after sitting there for a couple of days waiting for the government trucks to come that never did, well, we are going to move these things ourselves. And communities mobilized themselves and found people who had trucks and winches and slowly started to um, move the rubble away themselves and to free people and bring them to hospital and things like that. And they learned a very powerful lesson that they could do things themselves. And again, if there is this claim that people in Mexico are so subservient, this is the moment of real efficacy. Being able to do something yourself and realizing that you can impact change. But it has also made them realize how inefficient the government was, and that the government was also to a large scale responsible for, obviously not the earthquake itself, but the fact that the buildings were so poorly built. Because what had happened was that Mexico may have had building standards right with what kind of materials you're supposed to be working with. But because Mexico during that time, with the PRI in power, had such a corrupt system, what would generally happen is that government would put out a call or okay, bids, we are going to build a new school. And so they get a bid from one construction company and the second construction company. And the second construction company says, listen, our bids may be about the same as the first company, but in return, we will give you a kickback, right? You guys will pay us $100 million to build the school, and we will give back $50,000 to PRI party, uh, the kickback, right? And that's what kept the PRI party wealthy. Now, to be able to do that, they say, well, now we can't build the school. We don't have it really, what it will take. $900,000 to build this, and then we don't make enough profit. So instead, we will use cheaper building materials. That, of course, is a problem. But when the inspector come, they come from the government, and we will just send them to government officials. We'll say, no, that's okay. Look the other way. And so this system of corporatismo tended to allow some of the construction to go along in a very substandard manner where they weren't paying attention or weren't required to stand by the official standards. So this earthquake really exposed government shortcomings, and as a result of the people having to solve the problems on their own and finding that they could do a pretty good job of doing this, uh, this kind of group called the neighborhood associations were formed. concerned that government was really too corrupt, and if you want good government, you're going to have it to do it yourself, right? And these groups remained in place even after the destruction of their earthquake had been cleared away, and people started to rely on themselves even more. Here again, the little bit of an image of earthquake to give you an idea of kind of destruction that that had actually happened. Mm, um, Massive, large-scale destruction wrought by the earthquake. So now the final example is from the article dealing with the civil society, brings us to the modern day of 1990s, and we have a group in civil society called the Zapatista National Liberation Army, um, in rural part of Mexico, Chiapas, which was challenging NAFTA. So NAFTA had just gone into place, and one of the problem with NAFTA is that it would allow more free trade between Mexico and US and Canada. But as a result, a lot of farmers farm agriculture products that could be produced more cheaply in US would be coming across the border and being sold in Mexico, essentially putting a lot of local farmers out of business, because they simply were still producing things in a very traditional manner. Many of these were Aboriginal people, the native population, and they were still tilling the ground with a mule or oxen, pulling it till through the ground, and they were a lot slower and not efficient as old MacDonald in Iowa, who could, with a gigantic carbine, produce 20 times as much corn for quarter of a price than the Mexican farmer, even factoring in the transportation cost. So these farmers were protesting NAFTA and this free trade agreement and the changes that it was causing in the rural Mexico. Now, on top of this, like I say, in rural Mexico, the population is not like in the city, but it was highly native and highly aboriginal. There's not been that much mixing between the Europeans and the native population that was there. And so they had much larger recognition of problems that existed in Mexico where the Aboriginal groups were marginalized so much. So it was picking up on the economic discontentment that also, but also on the lack of recognition of indigenous populations issues. However, their response of the Zapatista Liberation Army was not just send a letter or try to elect people, but they resorted to what we would call mandatory, um, right? When you went out on the roads in rural Chiapas, suddenly there would be a roadblocks, jeep there in front of you, a gentleman with a machine gun would come towards you and ask to support their Zapatista National Liberation Army, and you would say, "Hell yeah, Viva Zapata!" And they would say, "Well, how about a contribution for the movement?" And you would say, "What contribution?" And they would say, "Señor, por favor," right? 200 pesos, and you would leave that place little bit lighter, uh, a little bit of Robin Hood action, if you may call that way. Now, the problem with those kind of things, they also resorted to actually more of terrorist means, like if it's if it's not terrorist enough, but it's also some kind of kidnapping government officials and things like that to push the movement's agenda. So it was somewhat violent movement as well, and the response of the government, um, rather than to enter into discussion and negotiation with the group, was to simply say these are criminals, branding them as terrorists, and they sent in the military, and there was actually, violence. And also, the sad thing about this might be that as a result, that group and civil society's role in that group was not viewed positively, but quite negatively. Mm. It really made people say, listen, we understand that the native population has certain concerns, but we do not support the way in which they have gone about this. And we support the government's law and order direction, right? And a group like this must be dealt with forcefully rather than sitting down at the negotiation table with such people. So, in a sense, this is an example of, um, maybe a two-step forward and one step back in a slow development of vibrant, independent civil society in Mexico. But we are going to leave Mexico now and go back to Southeast Asia to the chapter on activists. The chapter here, I guess, there is this idea that activists and civil society, although we are going to talk about them, and they played a role in fighting the spread of HIV. But they can't really be solutions for everything because, again, activists themselves don't wield power, they don't run government. Interest groups or socialist movements don't run government. Instead, they must try to influence the government, either through their members or their wealth or their good ideas or some kind of means of pressure. And as such, if you are trying to bring about change and you go through an interest group, an activist, it's going to be a longer because you are first going to get that group organized and then they have to influence the government because you still need the government to move. So you might get more direct response by simply going to the government. But again, you as an individual know how powerful are you. Unless you are very wealthy, you are not very powerful, and you might need to first organize with others to get policies to change. But looking more specifically in the country that they focus on, again, here the poster child is Thailand. And in Thailand, the book identifies that there were two important strands of civil society that helped um, fight against AIDS and spread of HIV. The first of these, rather maybe unexpectedly, is organized religion, um, right? In Thailand, the religion of choice, if you want to call it, is Buddhism, and the book maps out the way in which these Buddhist monks were able to op- open up to sick individual people who are suffering from AIDS, and offer like auspice kind of thing. In a sense, they couldn't cure the disease, but they certainly could take care of them while they were very sick, which was useful in two regards. One, it took them out of general circulation. They weren't going on spreading diseases anymore through unsafe practices, but it also modeled for society, for a society that was very fearful of AIDS and thought and uneducated as how to um, exactly how to deal how the HIV spreads. by saying we take them into our